public hearing on the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties for its inquiry into the agreement amongst the Australian Government, the Government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the Government of the United States of America for the cooperation related to the naval nuclear propulsion, commonly referred to as AUKUS. I begin this hearing by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land in which we meet and pay my respects to elders both past and present. I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to any First Nations people who might be joining us today. In accordance with the committee's resolution on the 4th of August 2022, this hearing will be broadcast and proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. I remind all members of the media for the need of fair and accurate reporting of the proceedings of the committee. Before we begin and welcome our first witnesses, we do have quorum present. Myself and the member for Spence are here in Adelaide, and Senator Forsyth from South Australia has joined us via the telephone. I'd now like to welcome representatives of the Friends of the Earth Adelaide branch and Caring South Australia to give evidence today. And for the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee? Starting with you, Robin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the hearing. We are Robin Jenkin and Michelle Madigan, and we represent a group of concerned people called Caring for SA. We came together first as a group to protest against the siting of a nuclear waste facility at Kimber. We have a background in education. Given the small amount of time allowed us, we'll focus on 3 issues raised in our written submission. Firstly, lack of consultation.
Sorry, just a moment. We're just doing introductions and then we'll come back to opening statements. So then,
Okay.
Sister.
And I'm Michelle Madigan, Sister of St Joseph, a member of the Caring of South Australia.
So, my name is Philip White. I'm a member of the Administration and Strategy Collective of Friends of the Earth Adelaide.
Great. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standings as the proceedings of respective houses. The giving of false and misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It is the responsibility of witnesses to accurately record any questions on notice that are taken. I'd now like to invite each organisation to make a brief opening statement. So please continue, Robin.
So on behalf of Caring for South Australia, our first issue is the lack of consultation, the lack of regulator independence and the extraordinary powers given to the Minister. Firstly, we point out that a cause for genuine concern is a lack of independence in that it's proposed that the new regulator now be situated within the Government Defence Department. This lack of consultation has also raised concerns that the current bill provides the Minister to give the regulator directions in some circumstances. This is not independence, and it's a serious flaw in the proposed legislation in a democratic country. While we note that the Minister is required to table in each House of Parliament a statement that such direction was given to the regulator, we note again with concern that this is merely an information exercise after the event and in no way inhibits the power of the Minister before he acts. As an extremely recent example of our clear concern articulated in our submission, lack of consultation, we were astounded to learn just last week that a metropolitan area of Adelaide had actually been named as one of the 2 nuclear dump zones. There's been no consultation with the people of Port Adelaide, a heavily populated metropolitan area, and we, like other South Australians, know that there's no safe level of ionising radiation, or to be more precise, there's no level of exposure to which there is no risk of inducing cancers. Further, the Minister himself may simply now name any area at all in Australia to be a nuclear dump site.
Our second point is about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Point 3 of our submission. It's of great concern that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Australia signed over 50 years ago in 1968, could be undermined by our acquisition of conventionally armed nuclear power submarines. And we quote the Defence Minister, as we do in our appendix, saying, "We are seeking to shape a region that is open, stable and prosperous, a predictable region where sovereignty is respected." So to ensure that our neighbours in the region are clear on our determination to make such sentiments a reality, at the same time as upholding the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, as we exhort in the appendix to our submission, we should sign the Treaty on the Prohibitions of Nuclear Weapons. This is our recommendation. Because by signing that treaty, it gives the clearest signal possible to the citizens of Australia, the Pacific Islands and other neighbourhood nations that Australia has no plans to acquire nuclear weapons. This would provide certainty to our neighbours and in particular to Indonesia and the Solomon Islands, who ratified the treaty only 3 weeks ago themselves. And this would also be what Aboriginal people in Australia have pressed for many years. Some of us have been involved with Anangu from our own state of South Australia, affected by the dumps in 1960s and 50s. Also, this would demonstrate by firm and determined independent action that we in Australia are indeed a sovereign nation, as the Minister says. Now, our last point that we're able to bring up today is about the cost of the project. Finally, it would seem to us that the cost of the whole project, calculated to be as much as an extraordinary Australian $368 billion, is excessive. This is only for one branch of the Defence Forces. This is especially the case when it is recognised that because of the rising cost of living, large numbers of Australian families are falling into poverty. Too many Australian children are going to bed hungry. This is a great concern to us that in this anti-poverty week, which we're in now, 716,000 children are noted be in this situation. This is amazing for a country like Australia. So this week it says altogether that there are 3.4 million Australians are food insecure. At the same time, there is an acute housing shortage, which we know, with record numbers of people homeless. Therefore, we decry the enormous expenditure as a reflection of misguided priorities and doubtful realisations.
Thank you again for the opportunity to contribute to the hearing. We look forward to hearing that our concerns have been addressed.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. White before we go to members' questions.
Okay. My name is Philip White. I represent Friends of the Earth Adelaide, as I said before. We made a written submission covering several important issues, but due to the limited time allowed, in this oral presentation I'll focus on safety. My relevant background includes 7 years working for the Tokyo-based Citizens Nuclear Information Centre, CNIC for short, including at the time of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. CNIC is a leading Japanese anti-nuclear NGO. That experience made me acutely aware of the risks of nuclear power. The Fukushima nuclear disaster showed how nuclear accidents can have serious impacts on communities far removed from the accident site. Emergency response zones are designated for planning purposes. These zones are mapped in concentric circles around nuclear sites, but the severity of the impact does not decrease in concentric circles as you get further from the accident site. In the case of Fukushima, the direction of the prevailing winds meant that most of the radioactivity was blown eastward out to sea. But the wind changed direction, and a few days after the earthquake, rain and snow dumped a large amount of radioactive material on the village of Iitate, about 45 kilometres to the northwest. Most of the residents of that village will never return. Likewise, when they eventually get around to emergency response planning for the AUKUS submarines at Osborne, zones will be drawn in concentric circles around the site for planning purposes, but that doesn't mean that in the case of an accident, radioactive contamination will not spread far beyond those boundaries. My experience in Japan also taught me that the nuclear industry is based on a great fiction, namely that nuclear energy is completely safe. This is referred to in Japan as the safety myth and was a leading cause of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. The public were told repeatedly that a serious accident couldn't happen. Even after repeated smaller accidents, near misses and scandals, the nuclear industry continued to promulgate this safety myth. It chose to prioritise its bottom line over taking precautionary action. For example, it chose not to raise the height of the Fukushima nuclear power plant's seawall, despite clear warnings from scientists that the site could be hit by a much larger tsunami than it was designed to withstand. Likewise, when the US and the UK assert that their nuclear submarines are completely safe, they are promulgating their own safety myth. Otherwise, no community would allow them to dock their submarines. That nuclear submarine accidents can occur was demonstrated by the sinking earlier this year of a Chinese submarine while in port. This example should give pause to any Australian city thinking of hosting nuclear submarines. Besides this, there are several nuclear submarines lying on the seabed around the world. They sank and are unrecoverable. They will continue to decay until eventually their entire inventory of radioactive material is released into the environment. Clearly, claims that nuclear submarines are completely safe are just myths. There has been no public consultation about the dangers associated with AUKUS. No attempt has been made to openly discuss the risks with the residents of Osborne. And it's important to recognise that this is not just a problem for people living near Osborne. In a worst-case scenario, most of Adelaide could be threatened. I therefore request that public consultations be held specifically focusing on the safety risks facing South Australians due to the nuclear submarine project. Allow me finally to refer briefly to one other issue raised in our written submission. We argued that AUKUS is not in the interests of Australia from the perspective of national security. Besides the direct negative impact of AUKUS on national security, AUKUS also represents an opportunity cost for the many other security issues facing Australians. I therefore call for an independent inquiry into Australia's national security priorities, where security is defined broadly to include not just military security, but also human security. That is, including matters such as health, housing, climate change, environmental degradation, etc. The inquiry should assess the impact of AUKUS on the security of Australians in the broadest sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. White. And Mr. White has answered the first question that I was going to put to both of you, which was, is this agreement in the national interests of our country? The purpose of the Treaties Commission is to basically answer that question, is this proposed treaty in Australia's national interests, and why? So I'll just put that to Caring Australia, given that Mr. White's already answered
I might
that.
have more things to say about it. Right, yeah.
And then there's a few other questions I have before we go to Mr. Spence. Sorry, the member for Spence, not Mr. Spence. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Caring for South Australia doesn't believe that this treaty is in the interests of South Australians. It seems to us that, as we mentioned in our submission, the extraordinary amount of money spent on the purchase of the nuclear submarines could be spent in other ways that would be much more useful to ordinary Australians.
Yeah, thank you. I come from a background of being involved with Aboriginal people, including people who were subjected in the 1950s and 60s to the British nuclear tests, and it's been very salutary to see this intergenerational trouble that's come and still coming. Somebody from the famous family, I just won't say their name, a disabled person has just recently died, again at quite a young age. And a spin-off from that, amazingly enough, Robin said about South Australia, it's bad for South Australia. We know it's bad for all of Australia. But we've got this history in South Australia. So astonishingly, the federal government has had a series of 1998, trying to impose a radioactive waste dump in South Australia, and the ladies that I was with at the time, the Kupapiti Kongajura, knew immediately when they heard about it that it was going to be a danger and something that they were really terrified would happen. So in the end, they led a whole national campaign and strongly campaigned, and the federal government at the time, which was the Coalition, in 2004 stopped that. Then it was taken to the Northern Territory. We're always concerned it's us central people that seem to be really put upon by our national government, and that was taken to a court case, and that was stopped. And then the government decided that they would impose on the iconic Flinders Ranges. So many of us were involved in that also, supporting the Adnyamatna people at the time, and almost beyond belief that it would be somewhere as precious to Australia as the Flinders Ranges. And then that failed. Senator Canavan actually was involved as Minister for Resources at the time, so he'd have a very clear memory of it. And then finally it was taken again over to the farming district of Kimba, and the traditional owners there were the Bangala people. And that brought another big campaign of South Australians knowing our history. So they fought strongly for it. But we're not just concerned about, and as we said in our, even in our short submission paper this morning, that many other Australians know that there's no safe level of ionising radiation. Actually, there's no level of exposure below which there's no risk of inducing cancers. Thank you.
If I can go to safety, because in your evidence you mentioned the bill that passed the Parliament, the Australian Navy Nuclear Power Safety Bill, and some political parties haven't sort of really stepped out in detail what the bill aimed to do. So I'll just read that out, and just if you could then let me know if you've got any further concerns or what you'd like to see to make it happen. So the purpose of the bill was to ensure Australia maintains high-level nuclear safety in respect to nuclear-powered submarines. And this is the bit I'd like your feedback on. It will establish a new regulatory framework that includes an independent regulator to ensure nuclear safety within Australia's nuclear-powered submarine enterprise and capabilities cycle. So we established, the bill that you referred to established an independent regulator. Is that not enough, or is there more that Caring Australia and Friends of the Earth would like to see?
Okay. Thank you for asking us, Madam Chair. That is one of the points that we are really very concerned about, that we just outlined the various anti-dump campaigns, and in that campaign there was a regulator called ARPANSA, who you'd be well aware of, and we did, many of us had quite some respect for ARPANSA because it did maintain its independence to some extent, and even challenged at some stages at occasions like this, the nuclear reactor, not the nuclear reactor, sorry, Lucas Heights people. This is our big concern, that this regulator, as Robin read out, is going to be within the Defence Department, as we understand it, and more than that, it doesn't seem to have any really control at all, because the minister at the moment, the Minister for Defence, whoever the minister is at the moment, Deputy Prime Minister, thank you, Miles, can override or can direct what the regulator does in some circumstances, and then thirdly, that he has to report. We understand that, to the Parliament, but he only reports afterwards. So it's just when the deed has been done, or when the legislation has been passed, or whatever the circumstance, it's too late. It's just a manner of reporting after the event. So no, we are very concerned about in fact, it's one of our main key concerns, that the regulator is not independent.
Yep. I support what Michelle and Robin said, and the issue of the regulator being answerable to the Minister for Defence is a major problem. And as I said, I had extensive experience in Japan, including at the time of the Fukushima accident, and regulatory capture is a major problem. It's a major problem in all nuclear regulators, probably all regulators in any industry, but regulatory capture was the basic, you could say, the cause of the nuclear disaster that happened in Fukushima. After the accident, they set up what they thought was going to be a more independent regulator, and it did behave with a degree of independence for a while, but it has been recaptured. And so putting it under the auspices of the Minister for Defence just makes that all the more likely to happen. Mm-hmm. And so the Minister for Health or the Minister for Environment or something like that would be a more appropriate place. And our original submission on that bill was suggesting that, was there really a need for a separate regulator? Would it be better to have a Panzer do the job? But I mean, I'm not necessarily committed one way or the other to that, but at least it shouldn't be the Minister for Defence to.
And just following up on that in terms of safety and waste, both your submissions raised concerns about the possibility of taking waste from the UK and the US. Could you step us through those concerns?
The issue is that it's taken years and years for Australians to reject various places across the country that might be suitable for the storage of radioactive nuclear material. It's been a long saga in Australia. And furthermore, as Michelle mentioned, South Australians in particular, and Aboriginal South Australians, have suffered tremendously in terms of the effects of the nuclear tests that were carried out in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so we believe that it's really important that the safety of such a nuclear facility is absolutely uttermost in the minds of the government, that they really take notice of the issues in the past as well as what could happen in the future.
The amendment that was put by the government, which banned the acceptance of spent nuclear fuel from the UK and the United States, was an improvement. And so the fact that that's been passed is some reassurance. However, the Virginia-class nuclear submarines that we're allegedly going to buy, we're going to imbibe them. So they've already accumulated a whole lot of radioactive waste. And although it's not been clearly stated to the best of my knowledge, I mean, we are essentially taking on United States spent nuclear fuel. The moment we purchase those submarines, they become Australian submarines. So as far as I understand it, they aren't covered by that ban. So in other words, we are accepting spent nuclear fuel from the United States. Now, okay, so if those Virginia class have been operating for however many years, say, I don't know, but say 10 years, and then we get another 10 years of them, then half of that's foreign spent nuclear fuel. Now, the United States and the United Kingdom are having massive problems dealing with their spent nuclear fuel, both civilian and military, and they haven't disposed of any of it. Now, what a convenient idea. The AUKUS submarines, they're a bit delayed. We're not building them as fast as we had hoped. Or maybe they ought to buy a few more Virginia-class submarines. Or maybe they ought to buy an Astute one or something like that. And so, this Virginia-class submarine's got 3 years' life left in it. Let's sell that to the Australians, and then we get rid of the nuclear fuel at the same time. So it's a loophole which, through the back door, we can be taking on spent nuclear fuel from the United States and the United Kingdom, despite the amendment that's been passed in the bill that was passed last week.
Just a quick clarification question, and then we might go to the member for Spence. Do you have an idea, do you know, like, how much nuclear fuel or waste we're talking about? Like, we do, as identified, we do have nuclear waste in this country already from medicine, not from nuclear power. We don't have a civil nuclear power industry. So I was just wondering if you had an understanding of how much nuclear waste we're talking about in regards to the AUKUS agreement.
So firstly, that detail is not public as far as I'm aware. It's the amount of fuel that's actually on those submarines, I'm not sure that's actually in the public domain. And I was looking at an article the other day by Ian Lowe, who you might be familiar with, Professor Ian Lowe, who's particularly expert in this area, and he was saying something like 600 kilograms of spent nuclear fuel at the end of their life from 3 nuclear submarines. But then
So one proposal, one that you've heard is 3 submarines, 600 kilograms at the end of their life.
But I've also read quite different figures which were much larger. But the point that I would like to make is that the degree of radioactivity of that fuel is going to be on a completely different scale from anything that we have dealt with in Australia so far. Because it's high enriched in uranium that they are using as the fuel, then some of the transuranium material like plutonium and other bigger things, probably there won't be quite so much of that in the spent nuclear fuel. However, the fissile materials, the cesium, the strontium and all that, that's all going to be there, and that's the causing the principal radiation risk in the early stages. Going on a few 100,000 years, the plutonium is the stuff that's going to be still around. But so basically, it's completely different from anything that we've dealt with so far. And the exact quantity, well, so that's not public, and so that's something that we actually should
like to know the answer.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, how can we develop safety standards, emergency response plans if we don't know what the risk is?
And also that campaign that we outlined for all those times, that was intermediate level waste, which is toxic for 10,000 years. And we were also worried about the spent nuclear fuel rods from the Lucas Heights reactor. So that was really a myth, that it was concerned about just medicine, you know, the small parts that would be toxic for much less, that often just disintegrate in the hospital or wherever it's called. And even that, the intermediate level waste is toxic for 10,000 years. So we're just extremely concerned, and Philip's outlined well the even higher waste that we're opposing in this situation of 100,000 years. Like, it's incredible, and we're just passing it down to the future generations to have to deal with.
And nowhere in the world is there a safe facility for the storage of this material. Finland has been working on such a facility, but it's still not proved to be as effective as they'd hoped.
Member for Spence.
Thank you, Chair. I want to just finish with the storage of waste first and foremost. Do you accept that we need to have a storage facility in Australia somewhere to
Yes.
deal with the existing level of nuclear waste that we have across the country?
Yes.
In a controlled environment?
Yes, definitely. Mr. Burnell, it was a part of all those campaigns that I outlined that, yes, of course, we accept they must go somewhere, but there was just so many, you'd have to really say, untruths or misinformation about where it should go and what was the appropriate place, and the need for an independent group of people taking it out of the political arena, batting against each other, and to have independent experts and really come to terms with what we've got already. But of course, the AUKUS surprise, we might as well say, in the last few years by both governments really, have upended that extraordinarily. And whatever we could do to prevent that and just concentrate on the waste that we have already, that's what our hope would be.
Is it fair to say, though, that there's been popular debate around the storage of nuclear waste across the country for the best part of 5 decades, maybe longer, and we've failed to come to a consensus on where we can put it? So
That's right.
it's at some point there has to be a decision made by the government of the day to deal with the existing waste that we have in this country.
Yeah, that's
we
right.
can't just put that on the never, waiting for 100% consensus from or through an independent process, because my view would be that I don't think we're ever going to reach 100% consensus on this subject matter around storage of nuclear waste, regardless of the level of waste that we're talking about. Would that be fair to say?
Well, I'd say that we wouldn't expect 100%, but overseas, when it has been a community event, as Philip pointed out, though, it's hasn't resolved the high level waste, but for other wastes, if there's enough community checks and balances and consultation, which certainly hasn't happened. In the last one, you'd probably remember that the people of people often, many of them, in the Flinders Ranges, there was a 50k radius, but in Kimber it was just moved so that it wouldn't be awkward and that people would agree. So a fair situation with the experts employed. I think all the experts agree there has to be a place, but our concern in this present situation that we're escalating it, to extraordinary waste, and as Robin said, there's nowhere in the world really except Finland, and they're still trying, and the United States have got an underground facility as well, but it's been broken down so often. It's scary stuff.
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Can
question.
I respond to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we need to deal with the waste, whether it needs, to what extent it needs to be a centralised facility. I think that's open for debate, and I don't think it's been resolved in a satisfactory way. I just want to point out that ACF, Australian Conservation Foundation, Friends of the Earth Australia, I'm from Friends of the Earth Adelaide, Friends of the Earth Australia have put in a lot of work into this, and their concern has been the process, and they have got ideas about a better process. I'm not going to sort of speak on their behalf, so I think that issue really should be, it'd be a good idea if you talk to them about the sort of process that they think would be the process.
I just wanted to just come back to your submission regarding the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the concerns that you had around the potential for perceived breaches of the treaty. Can you just go in a bit more detail on what those concerns are and why?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Now, Australia is one of many countries has already signed the treaty. But our issue is, if by acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, Australia will be setting a very poor example to countries that are yet to sign that treaty. There are quite a few countries that have not put their signature on the treaty, and we feel that we'll be not only providing a very poor example, but we could be leading to the undermining of the situation of the treaty, in that some of these countries could use our acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines as a way of pointing out that they don't need to sign that nuclear non-proliferation treaty.
Can I speak? The non-proliferation treaty actually has been signed by most countries in the world. There are only about a very small number that haven't. But the other treaty, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, has been signed by, getting up towards 100, but not 100 yet. But the thing is that these reactors use highly enriched uranium. There was some discussion about that on the meeting on Wednesday. There was a misunderstanding by Mr. Canavan. It's 93% uranium, something like uranium-235, and that is directly usable weapons material. And so these will be taken out of safeguards for the duration of the time that they're in the submarines, and that has never been done before. And so this so-called Article 14 of the safeguards agreement is something that hasn't ever been activated before, and there are concerns from international experts that this precedent will be not necessarily that Australia is going to use that highly enriched uranium to make bombs. It's just that, Iran says, Australia can do it, why can't we? Japan is another country who is a genuine concern in this. There are voices within Japan, despite the fact that their Hibakusha recently won the Nobel Prize. There are a lot of concerns that some of the politicians, the right-wing politicians, think, Japan ought to get nuclear weapons. So, and then South Korea is another one. So those are the other, and Brazil is another one. Those are the countries where these international experts on non-proliferation are concerned that the precedent set by Australia could undermine the non-proliferation treaty and the disarmament regime because of Australia's decision to go this way.
A quick follow-up. Do you really believe Iran's take notice of what Australia does in relation to this? We are talking about the Republic of Iran.
I mentioned Iran, I mentioned 3 other countries as well. But it's just a precedent, and they can use it as an excuse. Mm-hmm. And excuses are used left, right and centre. Russia will use it as an excuse to say that you can do that with Australia, we can do it with Iran.
But they also use excuses like Australia let women drive cars, so therefore we're opposed to Australia.
It's not just me. It's not just me saying it. It's not just me saying it. It's in our submission, in our written submission, I quoted a group of international experts who are highly regarded in this field, have been working on it for years, some of whom I know personally, and so it's not something that can be dismissed.
We'd just like to plead that out of all of this, this huge thing that's happened, that forget about faraway countries. This is the Pacific area that we're concerned with, and Indonesia is a huge country and has set us a lovely example just was a couple of weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah, that they've signed it. So we're just in such a conflict-ridden world, aren't we? We'd be, perhaps there's never been such a conflict, that this could be one little shining light that Australia does, stepping up. And also it proves that we are a sovereign country, that we're not just beholden to other big countries. This is really a big plea on our behalf, and not just our behalf, that as the government, when they were in opposition, promised that they would sign the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, that they just take this very positive step.
I think it just should be pointed out for clarity on Hansard too, though, that neither the current Australian government or the opposition have indicated any desire to have nuclear weapons.
Yep.
The proposal has consistently been conventional armaments on board
That's
the
right.
proposed nuclear propulsion submarines. And it probably just leads me to my last question, that when I look at Australian workplaces, we look at having the best level of safety, whether that's on a construction site or elsewhere. Is it fair to say that when we look at the terms of survivability for our submariners, that we should be providing them with the best chance of survivability, which can be argued is in the form of a nuclear propulsion submarine, given that you have significantly better speed for evasion, the ability to stay on location in a covert way for longer periods of time, increasing or decreasing the levels of detectability. Is that something that we should not consider when we're looking at these types of proposals?
I'd just like to quote, I suppose, the submariner Rex Patrick, who you've probably heard quite a bit from, and he's got that experience. But can I just move it on to back to just for a second, if you don't mind, that everybody says lots of things, don't they? And things can change, but when you sign a treaty, that is something completely different. So I realise you've moved on. I'd just like to say that, and I've realised you've moved on, Mr. Berner. But it's a very dangerous situation. We're not experts. We could take anything you wanted as a question on notice. That one included Friends of the Earth might like to say something.
I've got a few things I'd like to say. Firstly, on Australia, thankfully, I don't think that Australia is about to get a nuclear weapon. This is on your previous comment. However, bear in mind that when Scott Morrison announced this agreement, he said, and we wouldn't have nuclear power. And now, a matter of a few months later, his successor has said we are going to have nuclear power. So, you know, I mean, they say things, but you don't necessarily take them on face value. Regarding the issue of whether those submarines can get the submariners to safety in due course, as fast as possible, I'm sure that nuclear submarines go faster and for longer periods of time. However, do you want to put them in that danger in the first place? Do you want to send them up to be patrolling alongside China, or do you want to keep them further back in a more defensive posture? And that comes to the basic strategic posture that we adopt. We can adopt the strategic posture whereby our submariners are not in anywhere near as much danger as they are if they're patrolling in the South China Sea or something like that. And so in terms of the posture that we adopt, I'd just like to quote something that you would have read this morning in the newspaper on the ABC website, but a congressional report, what was it? The Congressional Research Service has just recently published a report, which, quoting the ABC here, using stark language, the report warns that the costs of AUKUS Pillar 1 for Australia could reduce, perhaps significantly, funding within Australia's military budget for other Australian military capabilities, particularly if the project's budget blows out. If this were to occur, there would be a net negative impact on Australia's overall military capabilities for deterring potential Chinese aggression. Goes on to say there's no indication that there's been any rigorous analysis of this AUKUS proposal. And so when you're talking about the safety of the submariners, that comes in the context of an overall strategic posture. And if you've got an overall strategic posture which is actually potentially making Australia a more dangerous place, then I think that the tiny detail of getting submarine mariners out of danger quickly becomes a much lesser priority.
And can I mention that Hugh White points out that there are other submarines, and in fact that there's no evidence that conventional submarines won't be as effective in terms of evading enemy submarines as a nuclear-powered submarine. They'll be just as fast and just as quiet.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of our questions. Did you have any more, Mr. Spence? And on that point with the news coming out of the United States, I guess that's where both of our governments are, in that we have democracies, we have a review process. That's what this committee has been charged with. It's to review and invite stakeholders and Australians to give their view on the proposed treaty. So I'd like to thank you for your attendance today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcript errors. Please send responses to any questions taken on notice during the hearing to the Secretariat by the 1st of November 2024. So thank you for your time and apologies for the late start.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. We'll just do a quick change here and would like to invite the Australian Submarine Corporation to come up and join us.
I'll take that.
Thank you, and apologies for the late start to your session. So thank you for staying with us that little bit longer. I'd now like to welcome representatives of the Australian Submarine Corporation to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee?
Good morning. Paul Gay from the Australian ASC. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for our Multi-Class Sustainment Division.
My name's Alex Walsh and I am from ASC and I'm the Chief Nuclear and Capability Officer.
Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as the proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false and misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It is the responsibility of witnesses to accurately record any questions on notice that are taken. I'd now like to invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to members' questions.
We don't wish to make an opening statement, thank you.
No worries, thank you. I have a couple of questions that I know the member for Spence does as well. This is our second hearing that we've had on the AUKUS agreement. And there's, I guess, contradictory and conflicting information that's been presented before us. And I'm hoping that you might be able to give us, I guess, some clarity or some answers to that conflict. If not, refer us to, I guess, an appropriate body or person that could. First of all, so we might sort of jump straight into that. Well, I've got my open-ended question first of all, which we've been asking all witnesses. Like the kind of the remit of this committee is to basically look at a treaty and say, is it in the national interests, yes or no, and then recommend or not recommend binding treaty action. So to that first general question, is the AUKUS agreement in Australia's national interests?
Thanks for the question, Senator. The treaty itself would be a matter for government. In terms of the national interest, what we would say is that from an ASC perspective, it does facilitate the transfer of information and materials for us to conduct our taskings.
And I'd add to that that it's going to enable us to build technical capabilities and create jobs and create opportunities for the supply chain as well. So we see those as positive implications of the treaty.
I'll come back to the jobs and supply chains questions in a moment. It's not an area we've yet canvassed in these hearings to date. But if I can just get whether you can help us understand this in greater detail. There's a bit of a dispute about the type of nuclear that goes, the nuclear fuel that is used to power these nuclear subs, and is it weapons grade or not? Is that something that you're able to shed any light on?
As it says in the treaty, it's special nuclear material which is used to power the submarines. I'm not across the detail of the specific fuel which is going to be used in the SSN AUKUS submarines or inside the Virginia class submarines. And the reason for that is that it's NNPPI information that's mentioned inside the treaty, and at the moment I've not been given access to that information.
So would you expect in the future, I guess if AUKUS is ticked off, we get into different stages of AUKUS, that would be something that your organisation, the Australian, your organisation would then have access to that information at the appropriate time?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The bill that passed the Parliament last week talked about safety and establishing the safety zones and Australia's continued commitment to the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Treaty, as well as the engagement of civil society. What role do you see that playing in helping the South Australian community, your workers, the community that sits around sort of where your premises are, in helping them to understand what's happening?
That's quite a broad question. And social licence is obviously an important part of getting the local communities, in fact the wider community in Australia, to understand what's happening in the programme. At this point in time, ASC is thinking about our social licence strategy, but our contractual arrangements that we have at the moment are very much in the early stage and planning, and we're not formally engaged on social licence work at this point in time. That's being led by the government through the ASA.
and what any recommendations on what the government could be doing in that space around consultation and engagement, given your history in building submarines in this country? Like, this wouldn't be the first debate that we've had. It's the first about nuclear powered submarines, but it's not the first debate about manufacturing, any like any of the needs of our Army, Navy or Air Force.
Yeah, so I can take that one. Our current community engagement around our sites, we've got a long track record of safety and environmental management around that, and we do community engagement. To Mr Walsh's comments around specific engagement around nuclear social licence will be led by the ASA, but we are internally obviously doing some proactive work around that.
One of the previous witnesses raised worker safety, assuming at some point your workers will have to manage this material. What process will you go through to establish those safe workplace practices?
Obviously ASC at the moment doesn't handle radioactive material. However, we do hold a licence for under our Panzer for our using radiation sources as part of our non-destructive testing requirements. We have started to recruit expertise and are about to appoint a radiation safety manager, and that person has experience of working within a nuclear environment, and we will be putting in place a radiation safety policy and all of the relevant management processes to cover that. They will be based around the current regulations which we have seen from our Panzer. We haven't seen the regulations which are going to come out from the new regulator yet, but those regulations are very close to the Panzer regulations to the limits and dose, radiation dose, which are used in the United States and in the UK. And our understanding from our discussions with our American colleagues and from my experience in the UK, the dose levels that we see on the submarine maintenance and in build are far, far lower, a fraction of the dose levels which are seen, which are the legal limits. So, and we'll look to make those what we do as low as reasonably practicable as part of our policy.
You mentioned in your opening statement about the importance this contract is for job and the supply chain. Can you just step us through what that looks like and what those stats are? Like, is it how many jobs we're talking about? Is it transitioning your existing workforce? Where are we at? Do we have the skill capacity in Australia to be able to do these jobs?
Thanks, Senator. It's quite a broad question. So in terms of our current contractual arrangements with the Naval Shipbuilding and Sustainment Group, is we are working to construct a support system plan and an associated workforce plan around both of those, and about what that system will look like. So we are in early days in terms of the total workforce which might be coming, but our contract at the moment is really more near-term focused around mobilisation activities. So we are recruiting, as Mr Walsh has just said, we are recruiting particular expertise, and we are recruiting people to deploy across into the USA as part of the uplift process.
Is that what you've done previously, say with other, with the Collins class? Like, is that sort of, it's not a new process, it's a process that's well established?
Yes, we in all of these major complex programs, you will have some level of international collaboration. In the Collins class, we collaborated closely with Sweden, so we do lots of technology transfer and skilling uplift as needed.
so far in these hearings, we've mainly focused on the nuclear aspect of these submarines, but there's a lot more that goes into the build. And as a regional MP, that does have significant defence manufacturing and maintenance in my electorate. I am interested to know the work you're doing around the supply chain aspect. Do you have an idea of how many small to medium businesses or businesses that might be involved in the supply chain, or any sort of early indications on the kind of work that may sit alongside the defence manufacturing side of things?
It's hard for me to say how many
Yeah.
businesses, but I will say there's significant opportunities. There is, between the UK, the US and Australia, there's a recognition that we need to grow the submarine industrial base, and there are proposals in place at the moment for the uplift of that industrial base in Australia, specifically to look at opportunities, for instance, to support the Virginia class submarine build. So this is near-term stuff, not just long-term stuff, waiting for when we start building the SSN AUKUS. To get there, we need to understand the requirements of the American program, and one of the things that this treaty allows us to do is to understand those requirements, and we have to then we were working with the supply chain with a supply quality engineering capability to help them understand those requirements so that they can meet that and qualify to be involved in that supply chain. My gut feeling is this is a significant opportunity for Australian industry.
Before we go to the member for Spence, just a follow-up, given that it's sort of really early days, we're not quite, and naturally we're not there yet with AUKUS, we're still having the debate about do we not ratify the proposed treaty. Can you give us sort of, in the corporation's experience of how you've worked with supply chains for your other builds and maintenance work? Do you do the maintenance work, or is that...
We do the maintenance work.
So how do you go about ensuring that integrity, quality, but also to that maintaining that national security focus in relation to our existing fleet?
Again, that's a big question. There's lots of layers to it. So for our existing fleet, we operate a sub-safe program. The sub-safe program is based around the systems which the Americans already use. It requires higher levels of quality than you would typically see on process plant, and we have to make sure that we do quality assurance and quality control in our supply chain and in the work that we do on site at quite a high level. We work actively with our supply chain so they understand those requirements, but you need to recognise that there is an additional overhead associated with meeting those quality assurance and control requirements that we have that are not normal for the rest of industry, and that carries an overhead, and the opportunity that comes forward with the AUKUS program to place more of that work with that supply chain means that overhead can be spread further, and that's better for the supply chain and makes the supply chain more resilient for Collins as well. So I see lots of benefits for Collins as well as for what we're going forward in developing the supply chain for AUKUS.
Member for Spence.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for coming and providing evidence today. I'm interested to know what challenges and risks are associated with building and using nuclear-powered submarines.
Yeah, go for it. Okay, thank you. Obviously, as I've talked about, there's the quality issues. Nuclear organisations need to be high reliability organisations. They need to have strong regulation around them. They need to have strong assurance processes coming from a good regulator. They need to have individuals, leadership and individuals inside the teams who have the correct nuclear mindset and culture. And there needs to be a continual focus on safety as the number one priority. We do not, we cannot condone deviation. We operate with a multi-barrier system to ensure safety, and we must have a chronic state of unease about any deviation that happens. All of those things lead to an organisation which is totally focused on safety and on the reliability of the product that we produce.
Anything further to add there?
Look, the only other thing I would add is that the operation and the selection of the submarine is obviously a matter for Navy, and I'd agree with Mr. Walsh in those characteristics of what our organisation will look like, but our obligations at the moment aren't set around the build, and we have a mobilisation contract on the sustainment part only. So all of those aspects will feature in a future support system.
Just going back to the works skills and jobs piece, what are you, because there's a couple of phases that we're talking about. There's the build phase of the actual facility to be able to construct these submarines, and then there's the second component, which is the actual construction of said submarines. So we're currently experiencing a lot of pressure in the construction industry as it is. How confident are you of raising the required workforce to complete phase one of construction, and then subsequently the second part would be to get the size workforce with the appropriate skill sets, and if there are perceived gaps in that skill set, like, what does government need to do to help facilitate closing that gap?
Okay, first thing I'd say is this: you talked about the two phases, and the first phase is the build of the yard. ANI, Australian Naval Infrastructure, is responsible for the build of the yard, and that's really a question that you need to put to them. The second phase of that, which is the build of the workforce for the build and for the sustainment, we've already increased our workforce significantly over the last year as we start to ramp up. We are placing people into Pearl Harbor for their training and development, and we're not having problems in recruiting the people to allow us to do that. And we've also launched large graduate and apprentice recruitment programs, all of which are aimed to get us on the right trajectory to be able to get the properly skilled, trained workforce in time for what we need.
Okay, thank you. Just my final question, Chair. What domestic or international mechanisms or learnings can be applied to housing Virginia-class submarines and building SSN AUKUS submarines to ensure community and environmental safety?
I might start on that one, Alex. As I mentioned before, Senator, we are currently constructing our support system plan, primarily focused at the Virginia submarines. So obviously we are working closely with our partners in the US, and as Mr. Walsh has said, we're sending people over there to be upskilled. So we're working through that plan right now. We're not far off submitting the initial draft to government for obviously review, and it'll mature over time. But in that, it'll focus on several areas, as you'd expect, of which one is safety and the skills and the training that needed to do the actual work and maintain those safety standards.
Yeah. Does that answer your question? Or?
To a degree. The reason I ask is our previous panellists we had in here, rightfully so, have a focus around ensuring environmental and citizen safety on a project like this. So I think there needs to be a level of focus on ensuring that we're meeting the appropriate expectation from society, because as we started off around social licence at the very beginning of your evidence, it's Without that social licence, there's going to be a high level of opposition to the build in general, so which in itself creates a lot of barriers to completion.
Yeah. Go for it.
I'll have a follow-up for my answer on those particular things. So I would observe that the US have been operating nuclear platforms for near on 7 decades and have not had a significant issue. And again, working with the US in their support system, it is our intention to adopt no less rigorous safety standards than what the US are deploying at the moment, including their oversight from naval reactors. And that'll feature as part of our plan as well, about how we collaborate and have an enduring relationship with those safety regulators and our own regulator when it is stood up. Alex, anything?
Yeah, the American and British naval nuclear programs have a vested interest in making sure that what we do is at least as good as the standard they do, because of any incident that we happened here would be damaging for their own programs as well. As far as the social licence is concerned, as I said earlier, we are doing some internal thinking at the moment, but at the moment the responsibility for the engagement is with the public is through the ASA at this point in time, until we get to a formalised contract and we've taken on and published a plan.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I've just got a couple of clarification questions, and then you're, I guess, off the hook for our committee. If you could talk us through what your corporation's role will be around handling the nuclear. So sometimes I think nuclear can invoke images of The Simpsons in people's minds, and we're not proposing anyone's going to be handling like rods, and I guess so we're sort of, because we don't have a well-established understanding of nuclear in our country, it's easy to see why pop culture can fill that gap. So perhaps it could help us in that when we get to the stage of building, how will the nuclear rods or the nuclear requirements come onto site? Who is responsible for that side of it? Will it be your own workers, or will there be a specialist team that comes in? Are we even at that stage yet? And then the second part to that is in the maintenance. Will it be required to be maintained? Because we've again heard some conflicting information around, do you even need to maintain the nuclear power source in these subs? And I know that once they're end of life, that's not your responsibility, that's somebody else's. But if you could talk us through what, at this stage, it's anticipated your corporation's role will be in terms of managing the nuclear requirements for this project.
So, firstly, for the build programme, we've been announced as the joint venture partner for the build. Our understanding at this point is that ASC will be a shareholder in the new shipbuilder. Okay, so ASC as a corporation will not have responsibility. It will be the shipbuilder's responsibility to do that, and it needs to be an incorporated joint venture because of it will need to hold the license for the site. Then the next question there, which is about the handling of the fuel and the loading of the fuel. The fuel will come from the UK, and it will be in a welded form as it's laid out in the treaty. But we are not at this moment clear. I'm not clear on who would do the loading of that. It might be Rolls-Royce or BAE Systems people, specialists. I'm not sure what that result would be. We're in early days. As far as maintenance of the core is concerned, there will be no maintenance of the core. Once it's in, it's there for life.
And just another follow-up, if I can, just about some of the other evidence that we have had before the committee, concerned that we're putting sort of our naval officers into sort of ticking time bombs and sort of easy targets sort of out there as they go. The design of the submarine itself, what I guess safety aspects are incorporated into the design aspect to, if there is a breach of a sub, that the nuclear aspect is sort of enclosed and won't be compromised. I say that thinking of a really bad James Bond movie, but I feel like some of the witnesses that we've had may have seen too many James Bond movies. I probably shouldn't say that about the Australian people.
So I can only talk about open source information. The reactor is contained within a reactor compartment. No people are inside that reactor compartment. So you haven't got people pulling rods in and out of a reactor, right? That's all done remotely. And any radiation, etc., is contained within that reactor compartment. So the submariners do not come across that on a day-to-day basis. So no, it's not like that at all.
My final question, just another clarification with your existing work that you do. It's never quite been the requirement of our defence manufacturers to have like a civil community engagement sort of committee, consultative committee, but they've become quite popular, say, in industries like the mining industry, where they will engage local stakeholders into, I guess, a reference group to hear concerns from local community members so that they can be investigated and addressed. Is that something that you see happening with this contract and this work?
That's down to the ASA and government. I'm aware of those types of committees around nuclear plants and facilities in the UK, but you've got to see how that all pans out. Frankly, I don't know.
Yeah, and so just to clarify, these are like the governments have their own committees, say in the mining industry, and their own consultation process, but individual companies have established in local communities their own reference group so that they've got that, I guess, community engagement understanding. So people working and living side by side have that direct ability to regularly catch up and have conversations about concerns they may have.
Yeah, that would all be part of a social licence plan, but at the moment, we're not responsible for that. That is with the ASA. Right, as we go forward and we get further into the contract, then we'll understand how it's going to be. But you're right. If you went to Barrow and to BAE Systems, there's a local liaison committee which is run by BAE Systems for that.
So it could be something that BAE Systems put in place. Yep. Okay. Was there anything further that you wish to add? No. Great.
Thank you.
Okay. I would like to thank you for your attendance today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and we'll have the opportunity to request corrections to transcript errors. Please send any responses to any questions taken on notice during this hearing to the Secretariat by close of business, 1st of November 2024. I'd like to thank members and witnesses for their time today. The next public hearing for this inquiry is scheduled for Tuesday the 22nd of October in Perth, WA. I now declare this public hearing closed, and thank you for everyone for your patience for the delayed start time today.